The snow fell gently on Boulder, Colorado, on Christmas night 1996, blanketing the affluent neighborhood in pristine white. In the Tudor-style mansion at 755 15th Street, the Ramsey family had just concluded what seemed to be a perfect Christmas celebration. John Ramsey, a successful businessman and CEO of Access Graphics, had watched his children unwrap presents with the joy that only Christmas morning can bring. His wife Patsy, a former Miss West Virginia turned devoted mother, had orchestrated another flawless holiday gathering. Their 6-year-old daughter JonBenét had been the star of the evening, her blonde curls catching the light from the Christmas tree as she played with her new gifts. Nobody could have imagined that within hours, this picture-perfect family would be thrust into a nightmare that would capture the attention of the entire world and remain unsolved for decades to come. The morning of December 26, 1996, began like any other post-Christmas day in the Ramsey household. At approximately 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey descended the spiral staircase of their 6,000-square-foot home, planning to prepare for an early morning flight to their vacation home in Charlevoix, Michigan. The family had planned to spend the remainder of the Christmas holidays there, and Patsy was moving through her familiar morning routine. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, something caught her eye that would forever change the trajectory of her life. There, spread across 3 pages of lined paper, was a handwritten ransom note. The note was unlike anything investigators had ever encountered, unusually long for a ransom demand, filled with peculiar phrases and references that would later become the subject of intense scrutiny. The note began ominously, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We have your daughter in our possession. She is safe and unharmed, and if you want her safe, you must follow our instructions to the letter." Patsy's hands trembled as she continued reading. The note demanded exactly $118,000 in cash, an oddly specific amount that happened to be very close to John Ramsey's previous year's bonus. The authors identified themselves as a small foreign faction, and threatened that any deviation from their instructions would result in JonBenét's immediate execution. The note was signed SBTC, initials that have never been definitively explained despite decades of speculation. What made this ransom note particularly unusual was its length and tone. Most genuine ransom notes are brief and to the point, focused solely on the exchange of money for the victim. This note, however, rambled for 2.5 pages, included movie references, and contained phrases like, "The 2 gentlemen watching over your daughter do not particularly like you," and, "Don't try to grow a brain, John." Patsy immediately called upstairs to her husband, "John, come quickly." When John Ramsey rushed downstairs, still in his underwear, Patsy thrust the note into his hands. After reading just the first few lines, John told his wife to call the police immediately. At 5:52 a.m., Patsy dialed 911. The 911 call would later become another point of controversy. Patsy could be heard on the recording saying, "We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please." She sounded panicked and distraught, though some critics would later argue that her distress seemed performed rather than genuine. More intriguingly, experts would later claim that voices could be heard in the background after Patsy believed she had hung up the phone, voices that some interpreted as Burke, JonBenét's 9-year-old brother, asking, "What did you find?" Boulder police officer Rick French was the first to arrive at the Ramsey home at 5:59 a.m., just 7 minutes after the 911 call. What he encountered was a scene that would later be criticized as one of the most contaminated crime scenes in criminal justice history. The house was already bustling with activity. In addition to the Ramsey family, several friends had been called and were present, including Fleet and Priscilla White, and John and Barbara Fernie. The presence of these friends, while understandable from a human perspective, the Ramseys needed support during this traumatic time, created a nightmare scenario for crime scene preservation. Officer French and Detective Linda Arndt, who arrived shortly after, were faced with multiple challenges. The ransom note suggested that JonBenét had been kidnapped and taken from the home, so their initial focus was on treating this as an abduction case rather than a potential homicide. This meant that the house was not immediately secured as a crime scene, allowing multiple people to move freely throughout the property. The ransom note had specifically warned against contacting police, friends, or family, threatening that any such contact would result in JonBenét's death. Yet the Ramseys had immediately called both police and friends. When questioned about this apparent contradiction, John Ramsey explained that his daughter's safety was more important than following the kidnapper's instructions to the letter. As morning turned to afternoon, the investigation took on an increasingly chaotic quality. Detective Arndt found herself essentially alone with the Ramsey family and their friends, as other officers had been called away to follow up on leads related to the presumed kidnapping. She later testified that she felt overwhelmed by the situation and concerned about her ability to maintain control of the scene. The ransom note had specified that the kidnappers would call between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. to provide instructions for the money exchange. As these hours passed without any contact from the supposed kidnappers, tension in the house grew palpable. John Ramsey paced nervously, Patsy remained in a state of visible distress, and the friends tried their best to provide comfort while staying out of the way of the investigation. By early afternoon, with no word from any kidnappers, Detective Arndt suggested that John Ramsey and Fleet White conduct a thorough search of the house to see if anything seemed out of place or if there were any clues they might have missed. This decision would later be heavily criticized, as it meant that potential evidence could be contaminated and the crime scene further compromised. At approximately 1 p.m., John Ramsey and Fleet White made their way to the basement. The basement of the Ramsey home was partially finished, with several rooms including a wine cellar, a train room where Burke played with his model trains, and various storage areas. As they searched through the basement, John Ramsey approached a small room that the family sometimes referred to as the wine cellar, though it was primarily used for storage. The room had a white door, and when John reached to open it, he later said he immediately felt something was wrong. When he opened the door and turned on the light, John Ramsey was confronted with every parent's worst nightmare. There, lying on the concrete floor, was the body of his 6-year-old daughter JonBenét. The scene was horrific. JonBenét was lying on her back, her arms raised above her head. She was dressed in a white long-sleeved shirt and long underwear, with white cord around her neck connected to a makeshift garrote fashioned from a broken paintbrush handle. Her mouth was covered with duct tape, and additional cord bound her wrists. John Ramsey's anguished scream echoed through the house. "I found her. I found her," he cried out, his voice breaking with grief and horror. In his panic and desperation, he immediately picked up his daughter's body, removing the duct tape from her mouth and carrying her upstairs to the living room. This action, while completely understandable from a father's perspective, further compromised the crime scene. By moving the body, John Ramsey inadvertently destroyed potential evidence and made it more difficult for investigators to determine exactly how JonBenét had been positioned when she died. When Detective Arndt saw John Ramsey carrying JonBenét's body up from the basement, she immediately knew that this was no longer a kidnapping case but a homicide investigation. She quickly called for backup and additional resources, but the damage to the crime scene had already been extensive. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. John Meyer, revealed the full extent of the violence that had been inflicted on JonBenét. The official cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation due to strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. In simpler terms, JonBenét had suffered both a severe blow to the head and had been strangled. The head injury was particularly devastating. There was a linear skull fracture nearly 9 inches long, suggesting that she had been struck with tremendous force. The weapon used to inflict this injury was never definitively identified, though investigators theorized it could have been a heavy flashlight, a golf club, or another blunt object. The strangulation appeared to have been caused by the cord and paintbrush handle device found around her neck. This makeshift garrote was constructed from cord that was found to match rope discovered elsewhere in the house, and the paintbrush handle came from Patsy Ramsey's art supplies in the basement. Perhaps most disturbing were signs that JonBenét may have been sexually assaulted. The autopsy revealed injuries consistent with both acute and chronic sexual trauma, though the extent and nature of these injuries would become a point of significant controversy among experts. As investigators delved deeper into the case, the ransom note became an increasingly crucial piece of evidence. Handwriting experts were brought in to analyze the note, and its contents were dissected word by word for clues. The note was written on paper from a pad found inside the Ramsey home, using a felt-tip pen that was also found in the house. This suggested that the note had been written on the premises, rather than brought from outside. The implication was significant. Either an intruder had spent considerable time in the house before and after the crime, or someone already in the house had written the note. The handwriting analysis proved inconclusive for John Ramsey, but several experts could not rule out Patsy Ramsey as the author. Her handwriting shared numerous similarities with the ransom note, though she was never definitively identified as its author. The fact that she could not be excluded as a possible writer of the note became a significant factor in the suspicion that would later fall on the family. The content of the note was equally puzzling. The $118,000 demand was an oddly specific amount, close to, but not exactly, John Ramsey's bonus from the previous year. Why would kidnappers know this information, and why would they choose such a random-seeming figure? The note also contained several movie references and phrases that seemed oddly familiar. "Don't try to grow a brain" was reminiscent of dialogue from the movie Speed, while other phrases echoed lines from Ransom and Dirty Harry. The lengthy nature of the note, its rambling style, and its inclusion of unnecessary details all suggested to many experts that it was not written by experienced criminals. As the investigation progressed, a significant rift developed between the Boulder Police Department and the District Attorney's Office. The police, led by Detective Steve Thomas, became increasingly convinced that the crime had been committed by someone within the Ramsey family. The District Attorney's Office, under Alex Hunter, was more cautious about pursuing this line of investigation. Several factors contributed to the police suspicion of the family. First was the ransom note itself, which many investigators believed had been written by Patsy Ramsey. Second was the fact that there were no clear signs of forced entry into the house. While a basement window had a broken pane, there was no evidence that anyone had actually entered through it, and the spider webs around the window were undisturbed. Third was the behavior of the family members, which some investigators found suspicious. John Ramsey's decision to pick up his daughter's body was seen by some as an attempt to contaminate evidence. Patsy Ramsey's emotional responses were scrutinized and, in some cases, deemed inconsistent with genuine grief. The family's decision to hire lawyers almost immediately also raised eyebrows among investigators. While this was arguably a prudent decision given the circumstances, it was interpreted by some as a sign of guilt rather than reasonable caution. On the other side, the district attorney's office and some investigators believed that the evidence pointing to family involvement was largely circumstantial. They argued that the brutality of the crime, particularly the evidence of sexual assault, was inconsistent with a family member being the perpetrator. Despite the focus on family members, investigators also pursued the possibility that an intruder had committed the crime. This theory suggested that someone had entered the Ramsey home on Christmas night, possibly someone familiar with the family's routines and the layout of their house. Several pieces of evidence supported the intruder theory. DNA evidence found on JonBenét's clothing and under her fingernails did not match any family member. This unknown DNA profile belonged to a male and was entered into the FBI's CODIS database, but no match was ever found. Additionally, a basement window was found open, and while there was no clear evidence of entry through this window, it remained a possible point of access for an intruder. Some investigators theorized that the perpetrator might have hidden in the house during the Christmas party the night before, then emerged after the family had gone to sleep. The intruder theory also attempted to explain the ransom note by suggesting that the perpetrator had planned to kidnap JonBenét but something had gone wrong. Perhaps she had awakened and struggled, leading to the fatal head injury. The perpetrator then might have decided to construct the elaborate ransom note as a way to deflect suspicion and buy time to escape. The JonBenét Ramsey case occurred at a time when 24-hour news cycles were becoming increasingly dominant, and the story had all the elements that captivate public attention: a beautiful child victim, a wealthy family, and a mysterious crime with no clear resolution. Media coverage of the case was intense and often sensationalized. JonBenét's participation in children's beauty pageants became a focal point, with images of her in pageant costumes and makeup broadcast repeatedly. This coverage sparked broader discussions about the appropriateness of child beauty pageants and whether JonBenét's participation in these events had somehow made her a target. The Ramsey family found themselves under intense media scrutiny. Every aspect of their lives was examined and often criticized. Patsy Ramsey's background as a former beauty queen was dissected, John Ramsey's business dealings were investigated, and even their parenting choices were questioned publicly. Public opinion was sharply divided. Many people, influenced by the media coverage and leaked information from the investigation, believed that the parents were involved in their daughter's death. Others felt that the family was being unfairly persecuted and that the real killer remained at large. The case also highlighted problems within the Boulder Police Department's investigation. Leaked information, conflicting statements from officials, and the contaminated crime scene all contributed to public criticism of the handling of the case. In 1998, Boulder District Attorney Alex Hunter convened a grand jury to examine the evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case. For over a year, the grand jury heard testimony from witnesses, examined evidence, and deliberated on whether criminal charges should be filed. The grand jury process was conducted in secret, as is typical for such proceedings. However, it later became known that the grand jury had actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and being accessories to a crime. The specific theory behind these charges was that while the grand jury couldn't determine which parent had killed JonBenét, they believed that both parents knew who had done it and had covered it up. However, District Attorney Alex Hunter made the controversial decision not to sign the indictments, effectively nullifying the grand jury's decision. Hunter stated that he didn't believe there was sufficient evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. This decision was heavily criticized by many, including some members of the Boulder Police Department who felt that the case should have been allowed to proceed to trial. Over the years, the JonBenét Ramsey case has seen numerous developments, false leads, and renewed investigations. Various suspects have been considered, including John Mark Carr. In 2006, this former elementary school teacher claimed to have killed JonBenét and was arrested in Thailand. However, his DNA did not match evidence from the crime scene, and he was quickly ruled out as a suspect. The McReynolds family, Bill McReynolds, who had played Santa Claus at the Ramseys' Christmas party, became a person of interest to some investigators. However, he was also ruled out through DNA testing and other evidence. Gary Oliva, a registered sex offender who had been in the Boulder area at the time of the murder, became a person of interest, particularly after he allegedly confessed to the crime in letters. However, no definitive evidence has linked him to the case. The case has been transferred between different agencies over the years. In 2002, the investigation was moved from the Boulder Police Department to the Boulder District Attorney's Office. In 2009, it was transferred back to the Boulder Police Department. As forensic technology has advanced, investigators have been able to conduct more sophisticated analysis of the DNA evidence in the case. In 2008, new testing methods allowed investigators to develop a more complete DNA profile from evidence collected at the crime scene. This enhanced DNA profile definitively excluded all members of the Ramsey family as sources of the unknown DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. Based on this evidence, then District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a letter officially clearing the Ramsey family of suspicion in their daughter's murder. However, this exoneration has not been universally accepted. Some investigators and experts argue that the DNA could have been deposited innocuously and may not be related to the crime at all. They point out that DNA can be transferred through manufacturing processes, secondary transfer, or other innocent means. Throughout the investigation and media scrutiny, the Ramsey family maintained their innocence and continued to search for their daughter's killer. John and Patsy Ramsey wrote a book about their experience, The Death of Innocence, in which they detailed their perspective on the investigation and their belief that an intruder had killed their daughter. The family also participated in several interviews and documentaries over the years, always maintaining that they had nothing to do with JonBenét's death. They consistently expressed frustration with what they saw as a rush to judgment by investigators and unfair treatment by the media. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in 2006, never seeing her daughter's case resolved. Before her death, she continued to advocate for finding the real killer and expressed hope that advances in technology would eventually lead to the perpetrator's identification. Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's brother who was 9 years old at the time of the murder, largely stayed out of the public eye for years. However, In 2016, on the 20th anniversary of his sister's death, he gave his first major television interview, reiterating his family's innocence and sharing his perspective on that tragic night. The JonBenét Ramsey case remains an active investigation. In recent years, the Boulder Police Department has stated that they continue to follow up on leads and that advances in DNA technology may eventually provide new avenues for investigation. The case has been the subject of numerous documentaries, books, and television specials. Each new examination of the evidence brings fresh perspectives and theories, though none have definitively solved the mystery. In 2016, CBS aired a documentary series called The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, which presented a theory that Burke Ramsey had accidentally killed his sister and that his parents had covered up the crime. This led to a defamation lawsuit from Burke Ramsey against CBS, which was eventually settled out of court. Nearly 3 decades after JonBenét Ramsey's death, her case remains one of America's most famous unsolved murders. The little girl with blonde curls and bright eyes has become a symbol of innocence lost, and her story continues to captivate and horrify people around the world. The case has had lasting impacts beyond its immediate tragedy. It changed how law enforcement approaches crime scene preservation, highlighted the dangers of media sensationalism in criminal cases, and sparked ongoing debates about child beauty pageants and the sexualization of young children. For the city of Boulder, the case became a defining moment that damaged its reputation and raised questions about the competence of its law enforcement agencies. The investigation's missteps serve as a cautionary tale for other jurisdictions facing high-profile crimes. The JonBenét Ramsey case also represents the evolution of criminal investigation in the modern era. From handwriting analysis to DNA testing to psychological profiling, virtually every tool in the forensic investigator's arsenal has been applied to this case. Yet despite all the technology and expertise brought to bear, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Who killed JonBenét Ramsey? Was it a family member, as some investigators believe, or an intruder, as others theorize? Why was such an elaborate ransom note written if the plan was never to actually collect a ransom? How could such a brutal crime be committed in a house full of people without anyone hearing or seeing anything suspicious? These questions continue to haunt investigators, the Ramsey family, and the countless people who have followed this case over the years. Until they are answered, JonBenét Ramsey's story remains not just a tragic tale of a young life cut short, but a compelling mystery that demonstrates both the power and the limitations of modern criminal investigation. The case serves as a reminder that some puzzles may never be fully solved, some questions may never be definitively answered, and some families may never find the closure they desperately seek. Yet it also represents hope that advancing technology, persistent investigation, and perhaps a breakthrough by someone with crucial information might eventually bring justice for a little girl whose life was taken far too soon on that snowy December night in Boulder, Colorado. As long as the case remains unsolved, JonBenét Ramsey's memory endures not just as a victim, but as a symbol of the ongoing quest for truth and justice in the face of seemingly insurmountable mystery. Her story continues to remind us that behind every headline and every investigation are real people, families torn apart by tragedy, communities shaken by incomprehensible violence, and a collective desire to understand how such darkness can intrude upon the light of a child's innocent world.